Still at the 10, still here, that's all me. Black love 2D. Hey y'all, welcome. This is MK with Feminist Women's Health Center. This is Skillbuilding Part 2, How to Talk About Abortion with Your People. I'm here with Adwan, moderator. So please introduce yourself in the chat, say where you're from, your pronouns, anything you feel comfortable sharing. We're going to wait a couple of minutes for folks to come in, and I'm going to play some music in the meantime. So chill out and sit back and relax. Welcome, welcome. We're just going to wait a couple minutes for folks to shift on in, and then we're going to jump into content. How's everybody been enjoying the conference so far? Have folks been going to other sessions? I went to the sound bath grounding. Hey, Crystal, nice to see you in this space. Hey, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Yes, please introduce yourself. Put your pronouns, if you feel comfortable, where you're coming from. I'm here based in Atlanta. My pronouns are they, them. And I'm excited to share this information with y'all. We'll get started at 2:05, let's say, so a couple minutes. I'm so glad to hear that it's been a wonderful experience. It's wonderful. Also, I wanted to say, if y'all have questions you already know you want to ask, feel free to use the Ask a Question function at the bottom of your screen. We also have a few questions from me that I'm going to be asking throughout the session. So if you want to jump ahead and answer those questions, you totally can. I'm so glad to hear the sessions have been good. I loved the grounding ritual. That was incredible. That was great. Hey, Jordan, welcome to the space. Yes, queer talk, queering RJ, so important when we talk about abortion to include queer folks. That's incredible. I love that. Welcome, Catherine. I love Gina's voice. I totally agree, Crystal. So soothing. I was like, damn, I feel so in my body. It's incredible. I also really liked that she called attention to just the importance of vocalizing, because I feel like sometimes folks really emphasize silence in spaces where you're feeling in your body, and that can be helpful, but also using your voice and vocalizing can also be really helpful too. So I loved that about Gina's whole presentation. It was incredible. Welcome, everyone. All right, we're at 2:05, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to cut the music for now. All right, and I'm going to share my screen because I do have a PowerPoint here. All right, hide that. Okay, y'all. So first of all, welcome to the space. This is Abortion Conversations Lab. So this is going to be building skills to talk about abortion with your people, with your family, with your friends. And so I'm really excited to get into this content with y'all. So my name is MK Anderson. If you're just joining, my pronouns are they and them. I'm the Director of Development and Communication at Feminist Women's Health Center, which is an abortion provider and reproductive health care provider. And we're also like an activist advocacy hub as well. So we do a lot of advocacy and education. So I'm just really excited for this opportunity. So thank you, Amplify, for inviting me to this incredible conference. And thanks to Adwan, who's our incredible moderator, who will be helping y'all out in the comments and, prompting with the questions and everything. So thanks for all the support, y'all. So I want to get into it. And in the meantime, folks who are coming in, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, your name, your pronouns, where you're coming from. I'm here in Atlanta, Georgia. It's pretty steamy outside, so I had to put my hair up, having kind of a bit of a day, but I'm here. All right, I want to jump into what this workshop is meant to accomplish, and I want to talk about some of the agenda items we're going to be going through. So really at the heart of this, I want folks to walk away feeling more confident talking with friends and family about abortion. So I'll say this is not going to be a session about slaying in the Facebook comments or winning at social media. That's not the kind of conversation that we're going to be talking about here today. This is more about talking one-on-one, in person, on the phone, with people that you know and regularly come into contact with in your life. And the reason why that is the focus of this session is because that is where we have the most impact, talking to people that know us, that already trust us. So that's really the key objective. So a few other objectives for this session are to learn about tools that you can use in everyday life to navigate hard conversations. Some of these will be specific to abortion access, but some of these can be used in contexts outside of abortion. So some kind of multifaceted tools. And also we'll be learning how to stay true to you when you're in these conversations. It's really important to make sure that you're not losing yourself in these, conversations that can be really heavy and hard. So just as a quick agenda, I'm going to talk a little bit about me and FWHC. I'm going to go through some ground rules for conversation that folks can add on to. Then we're going to go into useful frameworks to talk about abortion. So do's and don'ts, things that, aren't helpful when talking about abortion and things that can be really helpful. Then we're going to just talk more broadly about approaching conversation. Once you kind of understand the basics of talking about abortion, how do you start the conversation? And how do you navigate tensions and conflict whenever they come up? And then at the end, we're going to have a Q&A. And if folks want to go through any particular scenarios that they're really kind of thinking about, I'm happy, to kind of work through those with y'all as we have time. I wanted to also just briefly mention a content note. So we're going to be talking about abortion access, and some of those cases involve sexual assault, incest, and rape. So just note that we will be mentioning those things. We're not going to talk about them in heavy detail. It's just going to be talking about when we bring these particular kinds of abortion cases up in conversation. I'm also going to be talking about medical racism very briefly when I'm talking about my story and how I came to the reproductive justice movement. So if those are things that are triggering for you, please feel free to, get up and take breaks and come back whenever you feel comfortable. Okay, so first I just want to talk about me and also how I came to FWHC. So the reason why I want to start here and with a picture of me and my dad is because storytelling is really important and key when you're having conversations about abortion, about really any kind of topic. So whenever I talk about reproductive justice, I like to talk about the story of how my dad died, and it involves medical racism. So if that's something that's triggering for you, tune out for 3 minutes or so, and this part will pass, and we won't be talking about medical racism past this point. So my story starts when I was around 5. My dad got sick really suddenly and had to go to the hospital for surgery. He was recovering just fine. There wasn't any issue. And then he started experiencing symptoms of clotting in his lungs, so he couldn't breathe. He tried to bring it to the attention of the white nurse and the white doctors, and they weren't listening. And it wasn't until my mom, who's white, came to advocate for him that he got any care and attention about blood clotting in his lungs. But by then it was too late. And so he unfortunately died of pulmonary embolism. And I also say he died of medical racism. He died of medical discrimination, of racial discrimination in the medical setting. Instead of giving him help, they sedated him. They strapped him down to the gurney before he could get my mom to come and advocate for him. And unfortunately, medical racism is extremely common in all types of medical fields, but especially in reproductive health. So one of the things that brought me to the reproductive justice movement is this understanding that medicine can be biased. It can be biased towards people of color like my dad, Black people especially, also folks who experience gender oppression. So, you know, women, femmes, trans folks, gender expansive folks, all these people can face, you know, medical sexism, medical racism. And a really good contemporary example in the reproductive health context would be Serena Williams when she was giving birth to her child. She had the exact same complications from her cesarean that my dad did. Pulmonary embolism is what it's called, lung clotting. And the exact same thing happened to her that happened to my dad. The doctors did not initially listen to her and listen to her symptoms. Luckily, she was able to get the care that she needed, but that's just another example of medical racism in the reproductive health context. So I kind of grew up with this suspicion of doctors and clinics and hospitals. And one of the things that drew me to Feminist Women's Health Center was that Feminist was founded in 1976 on this understanding that medicine can be discriminatory against gender oppressed people, but also against people of color, like I said, especially Black folks. And I was very interested in healthcare that centered patient experience. And Feminist Women's Health Center, you know, tries to do that as best as we can. So just if you don't know who Feminist Center is, we provide safe and compassionate abortion care. Of course, we have a 6-week ban here in Georgia, but we still provide abortion care up to the legal limit, up to that 6 weeks. We also provide reproductive health care beyond that. So annual exams, hormone replacement therapy. We do trauma-informed care. So if somebody, you know, needs to go completely under for a pelvic exam, we're able to do that. And we're more than just a clinic, really. We also provide leadership development opportunities and advocacy and education opportunities. And our goal is really to make reproductive justice a reality in Georgia. So if you're interested in any of those things, or you're just interested in finding a healthcare provider that is rooted in patient experience, please check out Feminist Center. Our website is feministcenter.org. And so that's a little bit about me and FWHC. So before we get into the content, I want to go over some ground rules. I really like this image of community agreements from Rio Holiday. So some of these make sense, and some of these not so much in this context, but I still like the general idea. So some of the ground rules that I really like from this are to practice both and. So in the art of conversation, things are so multifaceted and complex. There are a lot of different ways to approach conversation. And so instead of saying there's only one right way, you either do this or that, it's really important for us to stay expansive about how we view conversation and know that there are multiple realities and multiple true ways to approach conversation. So practicing both and is really important. It's important for me too. So if you see me saying either or, you know, going into dichotomies, please let me know. I can screw up too. The next one that I really like is listen to understand and not respond. So this is something we'll actually be talking a bit more about just in conversation broadly because it's an important skill. But in our society, sometimes we can be really polarized in our thinking and want to immediately react to what somebody is saying, especially if it's something we don't agree with or we think we don't agree with them. So instead, I'll ask for you to really sit in trying to understand what I'm saying, what other people might be saying in the comments. as best that you're able, and try to seek to understand and come to that point of understanding what's being said before responding. The next one I really like, say it jaggedy, say it raggedy. So that just means sometimes, people are perfectionists, and especially someone like me, you want to say things perfectly, right? All the time. So in this space, this is a practice space. We're all going to screw up. I'm going to screw up. So please, if you feel comfortable saying something, know that you don't have to say it perfectly. And we are holding this space compassionately. It's a learning workshop. Another really important, community agreement is just knowing that technology is weird sometimes and it can break. And, we need grace for that, just because sometimes tech is hard. Another really important one that we'll be talking more about is speaking from your own experience. So it's important to use I statements or speak in my own experience. So the story I just told, that was something from my own life that happened. Another important thing to keep in mind is to be aware of your intent and note that that might be different from the impact of your actions. So you might have the best intentions in talking about, abortion, but your impact and the way you talk about it might still harm people or leave people out. So just know that in this space, again, it's a compassionate space. I'm going to try to hold space for people to, make mistakes. It's still important to be aware that sometimes our intent isn't always aligned with our impact. And then finally, take space, make space. In the context of chats, it can be a little less applicable, but just know whenever you're talking a lot or taking up a lot of space in the chat. And if you're somebody who's a bit shyer, I ask that you kind of push yourself a little bit to the degree that you feel comfortable to practice. As I said, this is really kind of a practicing space for people to learn together. If there are any other community agreements or guidelines that people are interested in practicing, please put them in the chat, and we can make sure that we hold that space together. Okay, so now we're finally going to get into helpful tips for talking about abortion. So these are the things that are great, are helpful when you're in conversation about abortion. So I have a couple resources here at the bottom. You should have gotten a folder with these resources in them, so I'm going to be referencing them throughout. So first, I would say keep it real and keep conversation in the I, meaning keep it in your experience as much as you can. I remember when I was first talking about abortion and just that issue, I would immediately go into abstract policy, philosophizing. That's just how I was raised. Might be a trauma response, probably, don't know. Point is, it's not always an effective way to get people to hear you. If you look at studies and research, the resource, the National Women Law Center Standout Phrases Guide is an example of this research about how people come to change their mind about something or to understand something. Sharing stories and personal experiences and real grounded things is what gets people motivated to act or motivated to shift their perspective. So keeping things real and keeping it in your own experience is really important. So I have a couple examples of keeping it real. So sharing stories. If you want to share your own story, I shared my own story, feel free to do that. If you want to share someone else's story, get consent first. So one resource I have here at the bottom that isn't in the folder because it's a website has some publicly available stories. So sometimes it might be helpful for you to read a publicly available story with another person. So you can head to 1in3 Abortion Story Campaign, and you'll see a whole bunch of stories from different kinds of people and a whole bunch of different languages too. So sharing stories is really important. It's what resonates with people, what gets them motivated to change, to shift their perspective. Another example of keeping it real and in the I is to use I statements. I couldn't find a picture of I, so I just got a picture of a cat taking a selfie. So, talk about yourself, talk about your own experiences. And, this also helps people feel more at ease because whenever you talk about your experiences, you're showing somebody that you're willing to be vulnerable. And whenever you show someone that you're willing to be vulnerable with sharing your own beliefs, your own values, those I statements, then they're more likely to be vulnerable with you back. So that's really important. Another way to keep it real is to be upfront about your values and to share your values. The National Women's Law Center Standout Phrases Guide and the resource folder is a really great tool for identifying some values that people really resonate with. Now, this guide is actually something for legislators, but it's something that really can be used in a whole bunch of contexts, so I thought I'd include it anyway. So some of the values that they name are valuing well-being, valuing freedom, agency, and rights. So these are a whole bunch of different values that they tested out and saw that people really kind of resonate with that kind of value sharing. So sharing your values can really keep things grounded, as I said, in real, tangible things. I also just want to note, if you have a value that isn't in the Standout Phrases Guide, that's okay. One of the values that I didn't see in there that I hold is family. I believe everyone should be able to make the family that they want and be able to support them. And that includes being able to access abortion whenever they can. So that value about family isn't in the guide, but that doesn't mean it's wrong or it's something you shouldn't mention. So just keep in mind as we go through these resources that there are so many other resources and values and ways of thinking about this. So it's not just limited to the resources that I have on the screen. Okay, so the other overarching do is to say the word abortion and to provide accurate information about abortion. So this is really important because there's sometimes a tendency to want to hide abortion behind certain words. And this can be confusing to people because they might actually literally not know what you're talking about. And also it can re-stigmatize abortion itself. And we're not here to be stigmatizing abortion. We're here to be pro-abortion and to be abortion affirming. So it's really important to actually say the word. Some of the common euphemisms that people use for abortion that you should avoid include stuff like the right to choose. So that can be a really limiting euphemism because, first of all, somebody can have the right to something and still not have access to it. So that isn't even really accurate in describing what we want to say. And also, like I said before, it can stigmatize abortion because you're just not saying the word like it's a dirty word. Another example of a euphemism people use, especially recently, is reproductive rights, and using that as like a shorthand for abortion. And the reason that's problematic is because reproductive rights is a broad umbrella term that captures so much more than abortion access. But whenever you use it as a soft way of saying abortion, all of the other ways that people build their families, people need reproductive freedom kind of gets lost in the shuffle because really you're reducing it all down to abortion. And this is another issue where people can get confused about what you're talking about. So some people, I can kind of see whenever I say rights or reproductive rights, their eyes might glaze over a little bit, and talking about abortion kind of keeps things grounded in that experience of what exactly it is that we're talking about. So using the word abortion and avoiding those euphemisms is really important. For resources on other euphemisms, the Pro-Choice Washington Abortion Conversations Guide is excellent. It has a whole list of those euphemisms, some alternatives, and it also has a lot of really great example conversations between people and a lot of great examples of how to call people in whenever they, use euphemisms. Another way to, I lost my train of thought. So the second point that I wanted to address was providing accurate information about abortion. So it's really important in conversation to highlight that abortion is still legal in Georgia. We do have a 6-week ban that is extremely restrictive. A lot of people don't even know they're pregnant at 6 weeks, but it's still legal. And there are still legal options beyond just Georgia to get care if somebody needs care outside of 6 weeks. So it's really important to just continue to, dispel that misconception that abortion is illegal or that it doesn't happen in Georgia anymore. It's really important to provide that accurate information about the legal status of abortion. And if you're interested in learning a bit more about, the regulations around abortion and how those things work, I have a website here from the Center for Reproductive Rights, reproductiverights.org. It's a map of abortion laws by state. So, of course, Georgia's on there, but if you're in a different state or you're talking to someone who might be from a different state, this could be a really great resource for you to provide accurate information on the legal status of abortion in that place. Next, use gender inclusive language. And I include this in providing accurate information about abortion because abortion is not a gendered procedure. Anybody with uterus can get an abortion. A man can get an abortion. A gender expansive person can get an abortion. A woman can get an abortion. So it's really important for us to, be accurate and use gender expansive language when we talk about abortion. So that's important. And it's important in reducing harm and erasure in the trans and gender nonconforming, gender expansive communities. Because there is a history at times of movements leaving trans and gender nonconforming, gender expansive people behind. And we don't want to leave folks behind. We want to be able to hold everybody in these conversations. And these conversations are complex. But, hopefully these tools will help you get some nice key phrases. So an example would be saying pregnant person instead of pregnant woman. Or saying a person with a uterus instead of saying woman and assuming that captures people with uteruses. Some women don't have uteruses, so that's important. All right, and then the last these are kind of more general tips, and we're going to talk a bit more about these, but they're kind of just like a preview. It's really important to stay open in conversation. So listening to understand and not to respond, that's something we mentioned before. So, that means if somebody, says a woman's right to choose, instead of immediately responding and saying, that's not the right way to say that, I would ask maybe an open question and ask, what do you mean by that? And that's a way to kind of better understand where a person is coming from, and not so much about immediately going into responding and correcting. That can put somebody on the defensive, can lead them to be less likely to listen, to understand, and it can escalate the conversation. So I just mentioned ask open questions. That's a really great way to keep conversation open. So whenever I say open question, I mean a question that can be answered in more than just yes or no. So usually these questions start with what or how. So what do you think about abortion? How do you feel about Nicki Minaj having an abortion? That kind of thing. Open questions are helpful because when we ask people yes or no questions, sometimes folks will automatically be on the defensive because yes or no questions can sometimes be loaded. Are you pro-choice? Do you think abortion should be legal? They all feel very loaded, and people feel like they have to stay in the binary of yes or no rather than giving the full complexity of their perspective. So asking open questions instead of those closed questions can help people really feel at ease to share their whole perspective instead of just staying between these two boxes of yes or no. Next, staying open is important, and a part of that is also de-escalating when you need to. So we're going to talk about what de-escalation means and all of that. But for me, it just means sometimes emotions run high in conversation and de-escalation brings them down. So being able to bring your own emotions down is really important. We'll talk about tips for doing that in a bit. And also there are some phrases and ways that you can try to get conversation broadly to just de-escalate. So some resources for staying open include a 5 quick de-escalation tips sheet that I have in that resource folder. And then I have a sheet on the Buster method, which we'll talk about in a bit. So this is just like a preview of things to come. So the Buster method is just a way of approaching any kind of hard conversation. So please take a look at those and we'll talk about them in a bit. All right. So I talked a lot. So I want to stop screen sharing for a bit and just open conversation up a little. And I want people to think about their values. So remember, I talked about how sharing your values is a really important way to get people to listen, to share, to feel vulnerable. So now during this little breather, I want folks to answer the question. Feel free to put it in the chat. What values fuel your passion for abortion access? What do you believe? What do you value that brings you to the reproductive justice movement, to abortion access in particular? So while you're meditating on that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen in case there are any questions that I can't see. How do I stop sharing my screen? How do I do it? How do I do it? To close message. How do I share my screen? Does this? Okay, I think I did. Okay, so I'm stopping screen sharing just for a little bit so folks can answer that question. So it's in the Ask a Question section too. So the question is, what values fuel your passion for abortion access? So it's just helpful to identify, those values and to think about the values that you hold whenever you come into this conversation. Yeah, so healthcare is a human right. That's a great value. I believe healthcare is a human right. I believe everybody, should have access to healthcare. That's a great one. Autonomy is another great one. That's a wonderful one. I believe everybody should be able to decide for themselves when to have a family. Empathy, that's a really good one. Empathy is great. Who are we to say what other people should and should not do with their lives? And it's important for us to acknowledge people come from all kinds of circumstances. Freedom, that's a big one for sure. Freedom, I believe everybody should be free. Absolutely. Those are all great examples. So please keep talking about your values, and just know talking about your values in conversation can be a great way to build bridges with people, to get people to open up and tell you what their values are. And that can serve as a way to build on conversation. If we both share this belief that, everybody should build the family that they want on their terms, then, we should talk about why abortion should be illegal because of that. So that's great, y'all. Okay, so, and if you have questions outside of this or have additional questions about the resources, please feel free to ask a question in that section. I'm going to share my screen again. So Maddie says, trust, for those of us who know damn well we shouldn't be pregnant, we should be trusted to have and make decisions, the choices that let us stay not pregnant. That's a really good one, trust. I think that's so important, especially whenever you talk about abortion within the Black community, where, trust and autonomy has been taken away from Black women, especially. It's so important to extend trust to people that they know what's best for themselves. So that's excellent. I love that. All right, so I'm going to get back into it. I hope I can share my screen without exploding things again. All right. Okay. So now we're going to get into things to avoid. So things that don't really help when you talk about abortion. So harmful narratives. There are a lot of harmful narratives out there, especially after the Roe v. Wade decision. They were kind of all over the place. But I think that these harmful narratives I have here listed are pretty common and have been around for a while. So just, to let you know, there's some great resources in that folder about avoiding harmful imagery and narratives. There's a Teen Vogue article by Katie Fuchstick that talks about Handmaid's Tale and why that's particularly harmful. And there's the Liberate Abortion Communications Guide as well, which talks about all of these narratives and the different issues with them. So let's start with Handmaid's Tale, since I already mentioned it. So a lot of people will say things like, this feels like Handmaid's Tale, or after Roe v. Wade was, decided, oh, we're going to Gilead, which is the country in Handmaid's Tale. And the reason why that's a problem is because whenever we bring up Handmaid's Tale, which is a work of fiction, we're implying that reproductive coercion or oppression isn't happening or hasn't happened before this point. And that's just not true. Reproductive oppression, unfortunately, has existed in this country as long as it's been a country, and before, probably. And, it's important to acknowledge that. So whenever we use Handmaid's Tale references, it can often reflect a very white-centered narrative that leaves behind people of color in particular, Black people in particular, gender-oppressed Black people especially, who have been oppressed during the Obama era, during the Clinton era, during any other time period in the US's history. So it's really important that we don't, erase that reality. So in this case, reality is much stranger than fiction. So stay away from Handmaid's Tale stuff. The next one is talking about back alley boogeymans. So this is just the narrative that if Roe v. Wade gets overturned, or now that it is overturned, people are suddenly going to turn to back alley, shady, unsafe abortion services and will die in an alley somewhere. And this is something that actually comes from before Roe v. Wade as a decision was even in place, when people didn't have a lot of options, legal options for abortion care. And it was, something that they sometimes had to do, go, to places that, weren't always the safest, let's just say, before Roe v. Wade, because there weren't a lot of legal options. But in this era, it's really important to acknowledge that there are safe and legal options to abortion care. So there isn't really a need for people to even get the idea in their head that they have to go to a back alleyway to get an abortion. That's just something that is not needed. Sure, we have an abortion ban here, but people can travel out of state, and there's a lot of support to enable people to travel to places where abortion is safe and legal. Another thing that I don't like about back alley abortions is that sometimes it can stigmatize self-managed abortions or abortion care that doesn't happen in a clinic. And it's really important to just acknowledge that every pregnancy is different. Every abortion is different. People need different types of abortion in different types of contexts. And it's important to not stigmatize any of those, choices. So whenever we talk about expanding abortion access, we mean really expanding it to include all of the ways that people release a pregnancy. So coat hanger and botched abortion imagery is similar to back alley kind of rhetoric in that it's alluding to people being unsafe and taking abortion care in their own hands and dying, and, being unclean. There's like this kind of hygiene undertone that it's unhygienic to have a self-managed abortion, And just like with the back alley boogeyman, this can stigmatize self-managed abortion, which is a completely necessary type of abortion, and can stigmatize abortion that doesn't happen in a clinic. And again, it also kind of gets people thinking in their minds that they might actually have to do something illegal to get abortion care. And that's just not true. There are still a lot of legal options, and there's a lot of support. And in support, by the way, Access Reproductive Care Southeast provides financial support and also that logistical support to get abortion outside of Georgia. So it's important to acknowledge that. And then the last thing I'll say is Underground Railroad references. That's super harmful as a narrative. So for a couple reasons. First of all, sometimes people will say, just to say for people who don't know what this narrative is, will say like, we need to create an underground railroad for abortion care or something like that. So this is problematic for like two main reasons, I'll say. The first is that the Underground Railroad was a specific historical moment in Black chattel slavery history. And it's really harmful to appropriate that narrative in history and apply it outside of that context. So that's a problem. And then another problem is this idea that there isn't already a network of, practical support organizations like Access Reproductive Care Southeast, or, other organizations that already provide support for people to get a legal, safe abortion. So Underground Railroad references are just really unhelpful. Instead of thinking about what new things need to be created in this moment, it's much more productive to focus on what resources and networks already exist. So as I said, please check out those resources on avoiding harmful imagery. There are a lot of other narratives that I just don't have time to cover. So please, check it out. Okay, so the last one that I'm going to talk about here is Catastrophizing about Roe Being Gone. Actually, this isn't going to be the last don't, but it's the next to last one. So especially right before Roe v. Wade was overturned, people were really in the kind of mindset of thinking, if Roe falls, then the sky will fall. Or if Roe falls, then, things are truly hopeless. And the reason why this isn't helpful or productive is because it glosses over the fact that Roe wasn't great to begin with, right? So people say Roe was the floor for rights and was not the ceiling, and we want to have a very high ceiling of rights. But I say Roe was the floor for reproductive rights, and there were holes in that floor and people were falling through it all the time. So it wasn't a great floor to begin with. So it's really important to acknowledge that, while this moment is hard and it is absolutely dark and there are material consequences to Roe being overturned, it's important to acknowledge that Roe did not hold all of our reproductive realities to begin with. And it's just important to acknowledge that. Another kind of adjacent argument that people make is about 2016, or the impact that the elections in 2016 have had on the court that led to Roe being overturned. And the reason why this isn't really helpful is because, as I said before, people have been unable to get abortion care before 2016. In the Obama era, people, weren't able to use Medicaid to pay for abortions because the Hyde Amendment was already in place. In the Clinton era, it was the same thing. It, throughout all of these administrations. And so focusing or fixating on particular administrations or years, election years, are just not helpful, and it kind of also understates the level of planning and strategy that's gone into overturning Roe since Roe was decided in the 70s. So it's kind of also understating the level of strategy that has gone into overturning Roe. Another claim that is not great and is kind of counterproductive is trying to say Roe being overturned somehow delegitimates the court, or that certain judges like Ruth Bader Ginsburg were ideal, and if she had sat on the court, then things would have been fine. And so delegitimating the court isn't great, because if we delegitimate the Supreme Court, then we're also delegitimating good decisions that have had a good positive material impact on people. Brown v. Board, Obergefell, Whole Women's Health, when Roe v. Wade was, standing. Whole Women's Health was a really great precedence. So we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. And it's also important to not focus on particular judges, because first of all, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was actually an adamant critic against Roe v. Wade. She's written research papers about it. But also, it's not about particular judges. Instead, it's about a system that does not prioritize the needs of people of color, gender-oppressed people, Black folks. So it's really important for us to stop fixating on individuals and think more expansively about our system and how our institutions really have picked up all of these prejudices, and we're starting to see them show up, or continuing to see them show up in these Supreme Court decisions. So there's some great resources that I have in that folder that you can check out about Roe catastrophizing. So Liberate Abortion's Communications Guide. And I'll just say, for the Liberate Abortion's Comms Guide, that's specific to the Liberate Abortion campaign. So if you find yourself using that resource a lot, be sure that you're uplifting Liberate Abortion as a campaign. In that guide, they talk a little bit about what their campaign's about and how to uplift them. So just make sure that we're really crediting the resources that we're using and relying on. And the Pro-Choice Washington Abortion Conversations Guide is another really great resource. And there are a couple of specific conversations like between people that they talk about where somebody's catastrophizing, and they have an example of how to counter that. So please look at those resources. Okay, so this is the last don't. Yes, okay, gotta make sure. So sometimes in conversations about abortion, people sometimes imply that there are good or acceptable abortions, and then there are bad or unacceptable abortions. And it's really important for us to not assign value judgments to abortion, because really, being pro-abortion means being pro-abortion in, any context that someone wants an abortion. So it's really important to not ascribe value. And so some of the ways that people do end up in the good, bad abortion trap is by focusing on sexual assault or incest cases or cases where there isn't consent around sexual contact. And this can be harmful because sometimes, it can be harmful because you're uplifting one type of abortion as being more acceptable or more reasonable than others. And also centering these kinds of narratives also kind of, what am I trying to say? There's a word that I'm trying to remember. It, not stigmatizing, but it's, I can't remember the word. I'll try to remember the point and come back to it if I can. Sorry. I'm going to move back to early abortion only rhetoric. So another thing that folks say often is, I think fetishizing is the word that I'm trying to think of. Sorry, I'm still thinking about it. So, talking about these cases over and over again, sexual assault and incest cases, can kind of fetishize those stories and can kind of feel not great, especially if you're a survivor of sexual assault or incest. So just be mindful of that dynamic. So now I'm going to move to early abortions only rhetoric. Sorry about that. So sometimes people will say stuff like, well, it's not even a fetus at 6 weeks, or it's not even this or that in the first trimester, saying that abortion care in other trimesters is bad, but if it's, in the first trimester, it's okay. And again, we want to kind of stay away from mentioning the circumstances or specifics of when or why somebody gets an abortion. So staying away from that kind of early abortions are okay rhetoric is important. Another thing that I've seen pop up a lot is talking about how important it is for abortion care to be between a person and their doctor, or a person and their clinician. And it's just really important to acknowledge that self-managed abortions are a thing. And there are a lot of rituals outside of the clinical setting around pregnancy release that are legitimate and helpful to people. And it's important that we don't stigmatize those other types of abortion care. So keep that in mind. Okay, another breather. So I have another question for y'all. Please drop your answers in the chat. Can you think of a time where somebody in your life did a don't? So one of the things that we just talked about, did somebody use a narrative that was harmful or use good abortion, bad abortion rhetoric? And how did you respond? And if you didn't respond, that's okay. Sometimes we don't know that things are, harmful until we learn about them. So I'm going to give y'all a second to think about that. And I'm going to stop sharing so I can see if there are any questions. Let's see if I can stop sharing accurately now. Boop. How do I? Okay, I did it. All right. Thanks, Crystal, for uplifting the Liberate Abortion website. I really appreciate that. Thank you, Amy, for raising that about people talking about good abortion, bad abortion in conversation with people, and people really wanting to assign values to certain kinds of abortions. And that's like so important to point out that dynamic is happening. So that you're able to do that is incredible and great. I would say that if somebody is starting to do the good abortion, bad abortion thing, I'll start pivoting to my values. So I really value, like I said, family. I really value that people can have the families that they want on their terms, which means having an abortion, period. It doesn't really matter what the context is, or because I just value people's ability to, craft the families that they want in their own terms. So that's one way that I would kind of talk through that. I love what you're saying, Crystal, about values-based abortion support and going back to trust and trusting people to know whether or not an abortion is right for them. I think that's completely on the money. All right, so we only have 10 minutes left, so I'm gonna speed through. I appreciate y'all working with me as I stumble throughout this PowerPoint. All right, so we're just gonna go through this. Where did my mouse go? Mouse. Oh dear. Whoa. Okay. I'm somehow not able to see my mouse. Ooh. What the heck? Okay, well, I guess I can't make it full screen. I'm sorry. I don't know what's going on with my mouse, but I cannot see it. Can I see it? No. Haha, I did it. Okay. I did it without seeing my mouse, which is impressive. Okay. So now we're going to talk about approaching conversations. So we're going to just talk about some general tips about navigating hard conversations and staying true to your purpose and your values. So we're going to talk about the acronym BUSTER, which I talked about before. So BUSTER is this acronym that was developed by the Iowa Health Collaborative, and the context of the BUSTER method in the fact sheet that I have and the resource list is for clinicians that are telling somebody bad news. So just keep that in mind. Because of that context, I've shifted some of what they've said in this PowerPoint to be more applicable in this context. But I still think it's worth, checking out the fact sheet, because they have some great examples of useful phrases to, kind of talk through stuff. So the B in BUSTER is being prepared for the conversation. It's really important to know your goal in the conversation and know how to self-regulate. So like I self-regulate through smell. So I have smelling salts that I got from Ye's Botanical, and they smell really great. So that's one way I stay self-regulated. I smell something sharp and it brings me back to my body. It's important to stay self-regulated because for me, at least, whenever I'm not regulated, I'm not able to listen to what other people are saying. I start getting more responsive rather than wanting to understand. And I can get more defensive. So that's just what I've noticed whenever I'm not regulated in my body, in my emotions. Knowing your goal is also really important. And the goal should not be win the debate or like change the person's mind in one conversation. That approach can lead people to be on the defensive. And it also can kind of set yourself up for failure because these conversations are complex and they're hard to have. And it's not always realistic to expect somebody to have their mind changed overnight or like in an hour-long conversation, not even overnight. So a more realistic goal might be disrupting a harmful narrative or sharing your story or providing more information about abortion to somebody who already agrees with your values. Those are some good goals. Using I statements, we already talked about that. So I'm going to pass through the U in BUSTER. The S stands for 6 seconds. So don't be afraid to pause and to just kind of stop and think. I do that a lot because I just lose myself in my mind sometimes. So it's important to be able to kind of pause and not rush through things or feel like taking a moment to respond means your response is wrong or bad. No, that's not how it works. Don't be afraid to pause. The T stands for tell me more statements, which I think are really great, especially in times of tension. So open questions or questions that ask people to talk about what they're saying more can help people slow down on the other side and think about what they're saying and really focus on what they're trying to convey to you. It can also be helpful for you just because you can get a better understanding of what they're saying. Expressing understanding is the E in Buster. So that can be really helpful in de-escalation, which we're going to talk about in a second. I feel like I only have 5 minutes left. So an example of that would be what I hear you saying is. And so usually we use I statements, but in this context, it makes sense for you to say you because you're saying, I'm trying to understand what you're saying. So here's what I think you're saying. And again, that gets people to kind of stop. And sometimes I've had people listen to what I'm saying and they kind of hear outside of themselves, and then they'll start to kind of pivot what they're saying because they realize what they said isn't actually what they feel or what they think. So that's a really great way to express that you're understanding the person and also to get the person on the other side to reflect on what they told you. And then the R in Buster is reply. So in the Iowa Health Collaborative context, it's reply with a wish, but that's in the clinical context. So I changed it to reply with a value. So, ending on what's on your heart, what you're thinking. This is important to me because I believe X, Y, Z. So definitely check out the Buster Method fact sheet. I find this to just be a helpful approach, but there are lots of ways to approach this. Okay, so we're going to go through opening conversation. So this is just how do I even start this? How do I start talking about it? Asking open questions, like I said before, is really, really helpful. What do you think about abortion? How do you feel about it? Relating it to something that people care about can also be helpful. So Nicki Minaj shared her abortion story. Jamila Jamil also shared her abortion story. They're two different abortion stories. And people who are interested in pop culture or hip hop might be drawn to those stories and might want to talk about them. Also, for me, opening up, having activities can be really helpful to take the pressure off. And I say this as someone who's neurodivergent, who doesn't like eye contact all the time and is around other people who don't like eye contact all the time. So I have incredible conversations with people vision boarding. So that's what that picture is, a vision board. And it's something you can kind of do and come in and out of serious conversation in. And it's something to kind of pivot and talk about if you need a break from that hard conversation. Okay, now I want to talk about navigating and de-escalating tensions. So I have those resources at the bottom that we talked about. One of the important things to know about navigating and de-escalating tensions is to stay regulated and to know your limits in conversation. If something is escalating and you don't feel comfortable, you don't have to, stay and, take that discomfort. If you feel like you're not able to feel regulated in your body, feeling your emotions and feeling like you're able to control them, then it's okay to exit the conversation. Some of the ways to stay regulated that have helped me, like I said, are things that help my senses. So I'll smell something sharp. Some people are tactile and will use Play-Doh or will be playing with something that they can use their hands, with. Some people will hum or listen to a song. There are a lot of ways to kind of get your emotional level down. Another way to de-escalate conversation, especially if somebody is starting to get argumentative, is to ask more questions. So that gets back to the Buster method and could you say more? Tell me more statements. So, if somebody says, I just think that abortion is wrong, instead of automatically being like, well, you're wrong and here's why, you could say, oh, tell me more. What do you mean about it being wrong? And that, again, can kind of get the person to slow down and really think about what they're saying to you. And it can also help you better understand the person and where they're coming from. It's also really helpful to repeat people's words back. And this gets back to the Buster method, expressing understanding. It's a psychological phenomenon that whenever somebody hears what they're saying outside of themselves, they'll really be able to hear it and digest it and recognize if that's what they meant to say or not. There's a lot of really interesting research about that. So saying what I hear you saying is whatever the person said, or so could you tell me if this is what you mean? Is that right? Is another example, can be really helpful in de-escalating conversation and to get someone to come back to what they're talking about versus what the tension is. Another way to de-escalate is to identify common values. So, those I believe, I value statements, if you're both kind of saying the same statements, it can be helpful to bring that up. It sounds like we both believe this. Now, it's not an I statement. We're saying we in this context, but because the person has already said I value XYZ, it's, kind of a bit outside of that rule. So, saying it sounds like we both value family. That's great. So, for me, that means that I value people's right to have access to abortion so they can create the families that they want, is a great way to identify that common value and connect it to what you're saying. So even if they still don't agree with what you're saying, they can at least agree with that common value, and it'll kind of de-escalate this idea that it's you versus them, or you're just so different, so you can't see eye to eye. Okay, so this is basically the end. So I wanted to just take any questions. I also wanted to just say thank you for listening to this presentation. Conversations are messy and they require a lot of practice and patience. So please don't be discouraged if you mess up. There is no messing up in conversation. It's just what it is. And yeah, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if there are any last minute questions. I see that we're over in time and I want to be mindful of that. So sorry about that. Okay. I want to answer any questions y'all have. Any advice on broaching the topic for the first time with someone you have never discussed it with? Yeah, so I would say this is one where I would say having an activity or something that you're both doing together to kind of build trust outside of the conversation can be really helpful, because otherwise it can feel a little weird to just be like, I've never talked to you before. Can we talk about abortion? You kind of have to build a little bit of trust before you get to that conversation point. Or for me, that's what's been most useful. So that's what I would say I would do. Start with vision boarding or doing some kind of activity together and broach the subject, maybe using something in the news or something that you both have seen and recognized, so that you can kind of talk from that perspective. All right, so I see another question. Thinking about older women in my family who I see have knee-jerk reactions to me talking about abortion, through taking the time to talk to them about why they react that way, I realize a lot of women in my family have or have seen people be forced into abortions. Pivoting conversation to autonomy over our bodies open them more up to talking about it more and changing their perspective. I think that's a really great point, Raiha. I think that's an incredible point. Sometimes people are speaking from emotion in their experiences, and kind of acknowledging autonomy is important. Being forced to have an abortion isn't good, but also being forced to carry a pregnancy or to make a decision that you don't want to is also not great. That's a really great pivot. That's really great. All right, I want to see anything else. Amy says, I've learned to say I want to talk about this with you, but I'm not in a place to do that right now. Can we find time to talk later? I think that's a great way to close conversation. If you find yourself getting dysregulated, that's absolutely a wonderful way to kind of talk about, your feelings and acknowledge that moment. All right. All right, y'all. Well, I think I've answered all the questions. So thank you so much. Thanks for going over time with me. I'm sorry I didn't have as much room for a conversation that I wanted, but I appreciate y'all for sticking with me. Thanks so much for coming, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye, y'all.